You need to be thinking about it with each decision. Each decision you make has an impact, and I don't think that that's quite clicked with a lot of people.
People do want to have a say with what's going to happen here in the future.
We will collaborate with the municipality. We will build a trail. We will maintain the trail.
Here on the Northern Bruce Peninsula, we have a lot at stake.
Parsing off these extreme points of view, what should the rest of us be doing and the rest of us be advocating for?
But often SON is brought in far too late in conversations, or not at all.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Change, Balancing Protection and Recreation in Our Favorite Wild Spaces. Tonight's a presentation of Climate Forum, and welcome and happy you're all here. Our group is formerly known as Cat Grey Bruce. We changed names in January, and we changed formats to a simple monthly check-in with general issues relevant in our region and therefore relevant to ourselves and our lives, whether we live in downtown Owen Sound or Nayashinaming or in the countryside. Thanks to all our Indigenous neighbors, we respect you and your connection to nature. We're a climate group, a climate action, so you might be asking why we're talking about tourism, economic growth, and development here in our region. Well, it's all to do with nature-based solutions. We have the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity still ahead of us, and nature-based solutions help sequester or suck up our carbon emissions that we make. And locally here in our area, that means mature trees and forests that capture emissions through photosynthesis. It also means healthy soil, sequestering carbon in the soil when it isn't being degraded by tilling. And it means wetlands that are sucking up carbon with a combination of peat and photosynthesis. And of course, nature-based solutions also provides all the co-benefits like ecosystems for the species that need them, better soil absorption for severe weather for humans, and local food systems, and that wonderful salvation of shade in cool spots during hot and summer temperatures. I'll start us off with a general question tonight though, and that's why are we still seeing development at the expense of natural spaces and at the expense of potential nature-based solutions, even when nature-based solutions are included in local climate plans as a way to mitigate climate change? Why is this? If anyone has taken a hike or even just taken a breath of fresh air in a natural setting, you'll agree recreation is vital to our quality of life. Tourism stems from that. Jobs stems from that. Settlement can stem from that. It's another result of a robust tourism industry. And development causes stressors on our natural and favorite wild spaces to support this expanded population. I'm a settler in this exact same scenario. My family chose to live here because of the beautiful natural landscapes and natural assets, and we've certainly been responsible for our own trickle-down development here on the peninsula. So it's certainly a balancing act, and although there are some who pursue, on one hand, economic growth at any expense, there are also some who pursue anti-development at any expense, which I would argue is not resilient for humans at all, because we need some basic infrastructure to feed ourselves and connect with others. So parsing off these extreme points of view, what should the rest of us be doing and the rest of us be advocating for? So that's where our conversation begins tonight. We're going to explore the concept of change, and we've got four great panelists who are going to help us see if we can come up with some solutions and some different ways of thinking about this in our activism. I'll show now your whiteboard as a Jamboard, and you can add a sticky note with an example of change in your area, either at the expense of natural spaces or a successful partnership or project, or something that's yet to be determined. Our ultimate goal here is always to host a robust discussion and let the viewers form their own opinions. So you'll hear anecdotes tonight of development and anecdotes of protection. And I bet because of that, tonight will be more about learning together than any of other previous gatherings combined. So tonight we have Megan Myles up in North Bruce Peninsula. We also have Linda Reeder with the Friends of the Beaver Valley near Grey Highlands. We also have Dan Boisvert, who lives in Wyerton, or just outside of Wyerton. And lastly, we also have Emily Martin, Saugeen Ojibwe Nation representative. All these different points of view should allow you as a viewer to come up with your own conclusions, and hopefully we can share and cross-pollinate these ideas of how best to have sustainable tourism and sustainable development in our region. We also reached out to the Glassworks Co-op, who are creating a sustainable development. But unfortunately, Murphy's Law, the whole board meets on the third Thursday. So none of them are available tonight, as they are currently having a board meeting. So at the end of the evening, like I said, maybe we'll become more effective in our activism, and maybe we'll consider the potential pitfalls of strictly being anti-development. Without further ado, tonight, it looks like we've got about 45 people. We'll start off with what we on the peninsula have been seeing evolve over the past few years, and that's of sustainable tourism, in hopes that maybe we can apply some of these philosophies elsewhere to the region's development challenges. And I have the pleasure of introducing Megan Myles. Megan is the counselor, one of the counselors in North Bruce Peninsula, and she's the former chair of Bruce Peninsula Environment Group when the Sustainable Tourism Project was first launched as a grassroots initiative.
You're welcome. And Lee and I started chatting about tonight. Just thinking about this issue and why it's important. Here on the Northern Bruce Peninsula, we have a lot at stake. We have one of the longest coastlines, our municipality, in the Great Lakes Basin. I think one of the largest connected forests in Southern Ontario, and a rich biodiversity of rare plants and wildlife. We're the only municipality in Grey and Bruce that is not covered by the Conservation Authority as well. And we're within a 4-hour drive of over 7 million people, many of whom have been cooped up in small apartments and discovering what many of us have known for quite a while. And that's that renewed appreciation for parks and trails and nature. And many of these places weren't designed to handle so many people at one time. So it's certainly been too much, too fast for our small little rural community. And we've had difficulty keeping up, but finally, over 5 years into this journey, from that very first meeting that we had in October 2016, I think with the help of some of the people that are on this call, Laura Segerman from Parks, and Emily, we are certainly making some headway. Obviously, this first major wave was long before COVID, around 2016, and that was a turning point, especially at the national park, where for the first time, more people were turned away than let in. And that number was about 150,000. So word on social media had gotten out, and there was no getting the cat back in the bag. So that same year, I happened to move back to the peninsula where I grew up and opened a tourism business, the Fitz Hostel in Lion's Head, and I was also chair of the Bruce Peninsula Environment Group. So I was trying to reconcile these two roles, one, and whether or not my new business was contributing to the problem and threatening to destroy the place that was so near and dear to me. And I guess I realized that it was actually an incredible opportunity to be able to help guests visit responsibly and forge a deeper connection beyond that selfie for Instagram. So in October, we hosted that first meeting at the Rotary Hall, packed the hall, standing room only, and discussed the challenges and opportunities presented before us. That meeting led to several more meetings and conversations, and eventually, with support from the Regional Tourism Organization, Grey Bruce Simcoe, Parks Canada, the municipality, and Bruce County, we began working on the North Bruce Peninsula Sustainable Tourism Management Plan. That recommended a long list of actions to help us maximize the benefits from tourism and minimize the negative impacts. One of the things covered in that plan is this visitor use management framework, or what we've also referred to as the limits of acceptable change. And that's really thinking about both regionally and specific sites about what is the desired state from an ecological standpoint, from the visitor experience standpoint, and economic that we want for those areas. Meanwhile, we also developed a responsible kind of visitor manifesto campaign. So really the actions were happening on two different levels. One, educating visitors, as well as kind of this bigger picture of looking at our vision for these different places. So we finished the plan in 2018, and that happened to be the same year that there was a municipal election. So I was keen to start getting to work on that plan. So I decided to run. Tourism and Airbnbs and cottage rentals, those were certainly hot topics in the election. And so in 2019, council started working on short-term accommodation regulations, which are now being proposed and potentially passed next month. And then the pandemic hit. And so by summer 2020, when people could finally somewhat leave their homes, Toronto flocked to parks and natural spaces all over, and the peninsula was no exception. So last fall, prior to 2020, we hadn't had too much luck striking a tourism advisory group. That was one of the recommendations in the plan. But there just wasn't the political will. It's tricky because, and this was one of the challenges that the plan identified, was this tourism governance problem of who is ultimately responsible, whose problem is it to solve? And it is a really big one that none of us have enough resources to solve. So finally, thanks to Parks Canada, the municipality and parks were able to co-chair the Sustainable Tourism Advisory Group. And then that group has brought together Bruce Trail, Ontario Parks, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Regional Tourism Organization. So we've been meeting monthly since last fall. And it's been a really great forum to share knowledge and work on joint initiatives. Since there's lots of areas of overlapping jurisdictions. So we really do have to work together. For example, the Lions Head Nature Reserve or Lions Head Provincial Park, you have the Bruce Trail running through that area. The land itself is owned by Ontario Parks, but the parking lot is owned by the municipality. So sure, we could sit around a table and say, no, it's your problem. No, it's your problem. And no one actually take responsibility. And we've done some of that, but it's also been great to now sit around and be like, okay, this is what we can do. This is what you can do. So the STAG, the Sustainable Tourism Advisory Group, we have 3 working groups, an area management and capacity one, communications and infrastructure. So basically our 2 main levers, one is setting capacity limits. So recognizing that we can't always just build our way out of these problems. We could, but it might be at the cost of these natural spaces that people come to visit. We're probably never going to be able to fully satisfy Toronto's demand for nature with our limited resources on our little peninsula. And so that's why it's so important to kind of determine what our desired state is and be constantly monitoring the ecological features as well as kind of visitor experience to make sure those values aren't compromised. So yeah, that's the setting capacities, kind of the one lever, and then the other is education and influencing behaviors, because sometimes that's what makes the sort of carrying capacity really challenging. Is maybe 20 people are too many for an area if they're all putting garbage everywhere and going off trail and breaking all the rules. So doing both of those, but you still kind of need some sort of baseline number to design the washrooms and parking lot and all that stuff after. So it will be an ongoing process of kind of developing indicators and thresholds, prioritizing different areas and implementing different management actions, but we've certainly gotten off to a good start. So as I mentioned before, some of the things that we've tried this year expanding the paid parking program to raise funds so tourism pays for tourism, because we have a relatively small tax base. We're also looking to implement a municipal accommodation tax, which would be 3 or 4% on cottage rentals and Airbnbs and potentially all accommodation. So that would be another source of revenue for managing tourism. We've also done a huge initiative around just collecting baseline information in terms of visitor data. The shuttle pilot in Lion's Head. So we've been working with a private operator who rents parking spaces and then shuttles people to the trailhead and is also providing them with visitor information. The big message has been to plan ahead, book in advance. There's been lots of people that just see a photo on Instagram and then drive up the peninsula. So we're really working hard to slow them down and reiterate the message that you really need to book in advance. And we also want people to stay longer so they can be more relaxed and leave more money and less garbage in the community.
You've got all this tourism and you have the right people around the table, and you feel like you have levers to sort of play with the right mix.
Yeah, visitor behavior and education. So ultimately, we still need to, determine how many parking spaces are in the parking lot. And you can also look at that at a regional level as well. And I guess it's not being looked at this point in time, but really the only way that I can think of setting a regional capacity is limiting the number of kind of accommodation licenses, or kind of knowing like how many beds you have or people sleeping on the peninsula. I guess, yeah, but usually it's kind of like parking lots at different locations. And then designing for that capacity in terms of staffing, washrooms, other like interpretive services. And then the other piece, which could potentially increase that capacity number, is visitor behavior. Because if people are being really responsible and staying on the trail, maybe that area could handle a few more people without damaging the ecosystems or the safety of the visitor experience as well.
I mean, it's a capacity problem here, but it's a bigger problem that there are few places in Southern Ontario where people can have experiences like this, and everybody wants to go there, and we want this to make available.
Especially in the peak season, the grotto and flower pot, those are experiences for a certain type of visitor. And it's interesting, sometimes you think like, oh, it's so busy, like it's not enjoyable, but then you actually ask visitors and people, if you're in if you live in a city, people don't really consider it to be too busy at all. So as locals, we have a different perception of what the experience has been in the past and what we expect it to be. So I think to some extent, we are all grappling with that grief and that level of community change that feels totally out of our control. And in some places, we do have to allow for that to happen, because if we close off these areas and just say no visitors can go anywhere and people who live in urban places can't connect to nature, they're not going to value nature, and they're not going to vote for politicians who care about nature. And these natural spaces aren't going to get funded, and they're going to get sold to development. So this is where it is this constant balancing act where we do have to, these places belong to the people of Ontario and the people of Canada. And it is really special for them to connect with those places. And we have to allow that to some extent, but at the same time, we don't have to make all places totally accessible to all people. Right now, the Bruce Peninsula Biosphere Association, they're working on the Cabot Head Trail. So that would be a bike and hike path. And what's being proposed is it's not accessible by car. So that's not an experience. It's 9 kilometers one way to Cabot Head Lighthouse. And so that's not going to be an experience for all people. And just like the national park uses park zoning, where you have, the visitor areas like Singing Sands, Halfway Log Dump, and the Grotto. And then you have sort of the wilderness areas or backcountry camping experience. And then there's areas that are ecologically sensitive and that nobody goes at all. So I think applying that same kind of lens to some of our other like municipal parks and properties could be useful.
We're sort of taking a past and present and future look at the topic of change tonight. So there are lots of present issues, plenty to choose from, but we have two time-sensitive issues. First, we'll go down to Grey Highlands with hopes to get an update on the sale of the Talisman public lands to Westway. So down in Grey Highlands, I'd like to introduce Linda Reeder. She's with the Friends of the Beaver Valley. She's also with the Escarpment Biosphere Association. And she has an economic development background. So that's why we reached out to her and she was nice enough to agree. Hopefully she can give us an update on what's happening at Grey Highlands in the context of sustainable development and tourism and all this squares with municipal plans. Welcome, Linda.
It's interesting that you bring this up because we had a meeting this morning with Grey Highlands. The Escarpment Biosphere Conservancy has over 17,000 acres in Ontario, including a very successful trail on Manitoulin Island called Cup and Saucer Trail that sees 10,000 people plus every year. And let me say, first of all, as an economic development person, we're not always for development at any cost. I personally am not. It has to be sustainable for me to be involved. And it's been a constant battle throughout my career to have people understand that. But it's nice to work with the Biosphere Conservancy. Talisman has received an offer from a development company. We're not sure who they represent, but we're a little bit afraid that they're actually a front group for a much larger group that's going to come in and attempt to perhaps do larger development. Now, the Niagara Escarpment Commission controls that, so the likelihood of that happening, we're not sure. But they have an offer, it's conditional. When we met with them today, we told them that we had another offer. We had our own, a cash offer. So the final parts of that, it was based on an appraisal. So the final parts of that are being put together. And our legal advice was, well, put it in anyway and let the municipalities sort out the best approach that they want. But in the presentation today, what I said on behalf of the Escarpment Biosphere Group was that we want to collaborate with the municipalities. So there's two roughly 60-acre pieces that the municipality owns. They've accepted an offer on those two. We've put in our offer, but what we think is very much in favor with the community is we will collaborate with the municipality. We will build a trail. We will maintain the trail. We will set up parking if we have to, and we will do education on that trail as well. So it's all about maintaining the ecosystem, building a trail that's sustainable, and helping them with the tourism. Because the other statistics that I have, which I think this is very timely, the most recent Destination Ontario statistics show that the top two things that people want to do in Ontario, number one, they want to go hiking. That's 49% of their sample. Number two, at 34%, is they want to go to nature and be in nature and the wonder of it. That's how it was described. So these are the top two activities. And the other part of that study showed that the economic return of those people was $910 per group. Cup and Saucer Trail returned to the local community between $3.5 and $4.5 million. So that's a sizable return. And so it's hard to look at that and say, well, we don't want any tourism for sure. So that's where we're at right now. It's neither forward or backward, but we're continuing to soldier on. And part of the proposal for the lands where the Talisman Resort is that we maybe make an eco center where we could work with universities and so on to do educational programming there with a residential component or day and overnight programs. So that's where you're at with Talisman. My role with the Biosphere is to try and educate people like the benefits of tourism, the nature-based tourism. Also today, part of my presentation was, and you've mentioned this, Lee, in the beginning, natural climate solutions. You know, it's daunting to think of managing climate change by reducing all our emissions because it's terribly difficult. But in 2017, there was a report that said, you know, if we looked at green spaces as well as looking at emissions control, we could probably exceed our goals for 2030 by simply taking a more careful look at the green areas. And there's a recent Canadian study that came out about that this month, or pardon me, June. And it's one for Canada, and it has a lot more natural climate solutions related to agriculture, which is the first I've seen, but also the same old chestnuts, you know, maintain your forests, do not break up land that is marginal for any activities. That's not where you want the development to be. And Megan, I'm sure you're aware of the provincial policy statement. We're supposed to be doing development in the centers that are already there, not out where it's not welcome or where it can destroy the ecosystems.
Is there a capacity even in the conversation in this area in Grey Highlands? Yeah,
and that was interesting because in 2004, you know about the waterfall program, that visitor program that Grey County has. There was a waterfall right in Grey Highlands that hadn't really been recognized. Everybody local knew about it to go and have a bonfire, but no visitors knew where it was. It's called Hogs Falls. And I had just left teaching at Humber to go into economic development, so that became my pet project. And so we opened it up. It's owned by the MNR, but we put a little parking lot in there and so on. So it worked very well until last year, when apparently there was cars lined up all, you know, up and down the road and around. And so now it's become an issue. And Megan, this is something that, you know, while I was thinking about Hogs Falls today and the fact that it's caused a problem, I'm thinking, well, the problem is partly that there's this beautiful falls and you go through the forest to get there. But then when you get there, what are you going to do? And so people congregated and they sit around, but there's really nowhere else for them to go. So probably if we thought about this and work with the MNR, let's make a big long trail that goes somewhere else and looks at some other kinds of features and then comes back in a big circle to where the parking lot is. So they won't be congregating in that one little spot and having so many people there to do the damage. That's possible there. I don't think it's possible in your situation so much, Megan, but it's just something that I thought of. I mean, because the other side of my business is marketing, and I thought, when was it a problem that you had too many people? Well, yeah, when you're in your situation, Megan, it is a problem. But if we can find other things for people to do while they're there, we may be able to disperse them into businesses. One of the tourism projects that I did long ago down in Wellington County was the Butter Tart Trail, if any of you know about that. But basically it sent everybody around the community going to bakeries and buying butter tarts. It was hugely successful, and it's been copied other places. So a simple idea to get people out doing other things, and that's that's another way of looking at it.
Joyce asks what role the community plays in determining at the talisman lands. So maybe you can clarify, when you say we, is there a social enterprise, or is there a community group? What's going on with the other bid?
When I say we, I'm talking about the group from 4 to 5 people that are part of the Friends of the Beaver Valley, plus myself and Bob and, you know, the people behind us, excuse me, the Escarpment Biosphere Conservancy. The community has spoken very strongly, and the municipality around the same time started doing visioning sessions with the community, saying what do you want to have happen in the valley. Well, I attended one of those sessions. I think probably Joyce did as well, because she's very active in the community. And we heard people saying, well, we want it to stay natural. We want to be able to manage the groups that are coming in. We don't want condos. We don't want another Deerhurst or Blue Mountain in the Beaver Valley. But I'm not sure that fit into their idea of large development. So we haven't heard any more about that.
Nice. I'd like to introduce Dan Boisvert. we're going up to Wyerton, or just north of Wyerton. Dan, you'll clarify if you're north of the checkerboard or not. I invited Dan tonight because we're very interested in his point of view as a neighbor impacted by a potential development from a large organization, not unlike Westway, a large organization that states in their media release that the aquaculture plant that they're planning is of low risk to the shoreline and surroundings, but also states twice in their media release that, and I quote, that the economy has been stagnant for the past several years. So this is a big development in Dan's backyard. But welcome, Dan. And Dan, what did you know about aquaculture a few months ago, and what have you learned since?
Thanks, Lee. I've become an expert in 8 weeks, give or take. This all started really with one of our neighbors just going for a walk up the road, and he noticed some activity on 200-acre parcel of property that's usually pretty quiet. And I guess they were test drilling up there or something. And he asked some questions and got an answer that a large group from down east had acquired the property. And we're going to put in a big aquaculture facility and take water from the bay and return it, but not to worry. The water would be cleaner when it was returned. So this started us asking some questions, questions that we've had a great deal of difficulty trying to get answers to. A little bit of sleuthing uncovered that the group had, in fact, met with municipal council twice, had delegations before council in camera, went off the record just prior to the purchase of the property. And further sleuthing, we learned that the MNR had already issued an aquaculture license for the facility. The Ministry of the Environment is involved. They have acknowledged that they are in receipt of an application. They are aware of the project. But beyond that, we got no answers and were invited to file an application under the Access to Information Act. I've made calls basically trying to learn what aquaculture is all about. And I spoke to one of the people down at the University of Guelph that actually manages the aquaculture research facility there. She was aware of the project and indicated that she would actually be meeting with the group in about 6 days. I asked for an invitation to that meeting, but it didn't happen. Anyway, just through general questions, she told me that this group was planning on producing about 15,000 metric tons of Atlantic salmon a year output. The current total provincial output is 6,000 metric tons, so 2.5 times the current provincial output. We have reached out to the company through emails and phone calls with no response. We've saw a rather hurried press release, I think, that was put together. I think this group was basically caught off guard. They all claim that they can purify the water, but we started doing a little bit of mathematics. I had to brush up, and I do have some people over at the University of Waterloo doing some modeling for me. And we started playing around with some of the numbers that both the company has published in their press releases, looking at similar facilities around the world. Currently, the one that is proposed here would be one of the largest in the world, although I understand the last month or so, I think there are 2 or 3 of them that have been recently announced, and they're all vying for that title. anyway, the numbers are scary. These are huge volumes of water. We've looked at the numbers here. We figure with that kind of production capacity, even in, using the technology at 99.6% super intensive recirculative rates, there still could be in excess of 11 million liters of water a day taken from Colpoys Bay and returned, filtered and treated, of course, but to what degree, we don't know. And This is obviously a very big concern.
Is it all about risk? Why should people help stop this development? Are they paving over nature? What else is involved here?
Well, I think first off, we're looking at a facility, 500,000 square feet, 11 and a half acres under a roof on a property with a provincially designated significant wetland. We've also got an aquifer there under that property. We've recently had a wetland specialist join our group, and she's bringing us up to speed on that. Of course, our concern was the bay, but there are certainly some challenges that lay ahead here dealing with the wetlands. But I think the bigger question, Lee, is do we have to look at the future of the Bruce, and does something of this scale coming here, is it consistent with where we see the future of the Bruce going? I mean, we're talking about tourism and enjoyment of nature. Is this paving the way to one of Toronto's industrial parks? And certainly the company's indicated that's where the market is. We've got to consider truck traffic. We've got to look at beefing up the hydro infrastructure in the area. I mean, there will be a lot. These plants have huge power requirements for pumps and heating and chillers and scrubbers, and we have to ask if it's really consistent with where we all see the future of the Bruce. The other thing, of course, this area is a designated UNESCO Biosphere. Do we risk losing that designation if we start allowing projects like this to come into the area?
I'm wondering, has there been any environmental impact study on that? I mean, that would be one of the first things you would expect.
Right. The company has made claims that they have retained an engineering firm to do environmental studies. And Mayor and Local Council has said that will certainly be considered. Our biggest concern is really with an industry that has had the deplorable, environmental effects that it has. Should they have not been a little more conciliatory and come in and openly said, we're thinking of doing this in this area. Our fear, of course, is they do the environmental study. They've already gone ahead and started securing licenses. They've made the capital investment in the real estate. Is public input, if and when we're given a chance to respond to that, is it really going to matter, or is it going to be a done deal?
What would you like to see happen?
I saw an ad in one of the local papers that was taken out a week or two ago, and I think it was North Bruce, and they actually mentioned the project here, and they were actually soliciting for input from the community as to what you saw for the future. And I think that's the kind of transparency and the kind of engagement that the municipal government has to have with the community. I know Linda mentioned, they went to the local residents and they said, what do you want here? And they made it very clear, we don't want, we don't want these big business conference centers and, Deerhurst, that sort of thing. And I think it's important to get the input here. Our movement is a real grassroots movement. We've kicked it off fairly quickly, but we've had a lot of local involvement. I mean, people do want to have a say with what's going to happen here in the future of the peninsula.
Cheryl is asking, what is the municipality getting out of this? And it sounds like you've got a group together, which is great, the Peninsula Water Watch. And what's the municipality of South Bruce Peninsula getting out of this this plant? Is the economy really stagnant in Wyerton?
Well, we've got about 40 members in our committee now. A number of them are business owner operators in the area, and I think they would take issue with the statement that the economy in the area is stagnant. They're all very busy, and actually they're having a difficulty actually hiring people right now. They're all looking to employ people. So, the company statement of 200 jobs, which again is questionable. I don't know if the types of jobs that would come with an operation of this scale, I don't know that those type of people would be found locally in the labor pool anyway. I would imagine there'd be a lot of, marine technicians, technologists, veterinarians.
That's an interesting kind of relevant question. If the First Nations have been consulted, or if there was any response from First Nations.
Yeah, I was going to say Emily is our next presenter.
Okay.
So before we move on to Emily, I just want to pick up on one thing that you said, Dan, is that I noticed is that people around here have to figure out the vision if this is where the Bruce really wants to go. And that's an important segue to mention before we get on to our last speaker is that right now, Grey County, there's a bunch of things you can do to give your say on vision and planning. Grey County has a draft climate action plan out for comment right now that mentions nature-based solutions. It's not a pillar, but it mentions it in there. You can email public input on the Grey, if you live in Grey, to linda.swanson@grey.ca. You can Google it, and I'll stick that in the chat. If you live in Bruce, there's currently a public outreach called Good Growth, and it's at www.planthebruce.ca/goodgrowth. Yeah, thank you, Megan. You beat me to it in the chat. And they're coming out as well with a public engagement for natural legacy if you live in Bruce. That's coming soon. You can find it on the same website. But of course, the other major jurisdiction is the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. So Emily Martin is, of course, here, and she's the Resources and Infrastructure Associate at the SON Environment Office. And she's here to explain what they do. Emily, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Lee. And I'll start pretty general and high level because I think there's often not a great understanding of who SON is and what SON does in the territory. And I can use the aquaculture facility as an example when I talk about process here, if that's helpful. But so starting really generally, SON is the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, or SON. I'm sure lots of people are familiar, but SON is made up of two band councils. So that's Saugeen First Nation and Chippewas of Nawash at Neoshingaming. So two band councils, two chiefs, and two councils. And then the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation Environment Office responds to both of those councils. They have a joint council together. So I'm a representative of the Environment Office, and I'm essentially a public servant for that, for the nations. And so SON's territory goes from Tobermory down to Arthur in the south and Goderich to Collingwood. Those are kind of the markers that I tend to use. So when we talk about engaging First Nations on the peninsula, the only nation to be engaged is SON. There's very little territorial overlap. There's a little bit in the southern parts. But in terms of First Nation consultation on the peninsula, it's the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation whose territory we're talking about this evening. My role, like Lee said, I'm the Resources and Infrastructure Associate. So I manage the duty to consult for SON on pretty well everything in the territory that's not energy. So it's a lot of pits and quarries, major residential development, road development, forestry, landfills, water treatment, a number of other sort of municipal works, and then also the relationship with Parks Canada. And so that's sort of where the tourism conversation comes in, into my role, and how SON is involved in the conversations around tourism and development pressures that way. So the Environment Office, more generally, we're about 12 staff. It's a wonderful office, really excellent staff who do really good work, but to operate at full capacity and to do the work that we'd really like to be doing, we'd really have a staff of about 25. So we operate at about half capacity. And that's just the nature of funding, sort of the nature of the beast, I guess, and how Band Council funding works and the funding that's available. So all that to say, SON Environment Office is doing really excellent work, but there's so much more that we could be doing in terms of monitoring and contributing to review of development on the peninsula. But that's just the way it is with limited resources. So like I said, I'm not sure how familiar folks are with the concept of the duty to consult. I think it's a legal concept that sometimes people touch on in different areas of their lives, but the duty to consult is a duty of the Crown, so Canada or Ontario or the different representatives of the Crown. And I'll talk about that because that's sort of, Lee asked me to speak about SON's priorities. And so when SON looks at development, the lens that SON does that through is through a rights lens. So SON is an Aboriginal and treaty rights holder, and those are two different types of rights. They're distinct in Canadian law, and they're both constitutionally protected. So by the Canada's Constitution Act 1982, and that's sort of SON's lever to look when we're looking at development and how we review things. It's, okay, will this development impact SON's Aboriginal or treaty rights, and how, and is it at a level that's acceptable or not? And so those rights, it's complicated and the courts are constantly figuring out what they look like, but really generally Aboriginal rights are typically the right to hunt, fish, harvest, engage in ceremony. Those are sort of the high level ones. And then there are commercial rights in there as well. So when we look at a project, we look at the rights impact. So is this going to impact Aboriginal or treaty rights that are protected by the Canadian Constitution? We also do a lot of, when we're reviewing projects, we're sort of looking at, are the federal and provincial laws and policies actually being adhered to? Unfortunately, a big part of our role is sort of monitoring and making sure that other agencies are following their own rules. That also takes a lot of time and energy. We also look at, how developments will impact all species, not just species that SON might harvest, and not just species at risk. So SON does a lot of work around species at risk, but the review that we do isn't limited to those species, because SON holds different views that, all species are important. There's different species that are important for specific cultural reasons. So it's not just limited to species at risk, but we do pay special attention to that. And then I think what's sort of pertinent to this discussion here is we're also looking at habitat and ensuring that there's adequate and contiguous habitat for these species that we're talking about. And so that's sort of where this development pressure question comes in. And then when we're looking at projects, we're also doing a lot of work to make sure that ceremonial and archaeological sites are protected. So we work really closely with really talented archaeologists. And we also do a lot of review of other archaeologists' work. And then we're making sure that SON's knowledge and wisdoms of all different types are being incorporated into decision-making. And that's really about making sure that there's the best outcome possible for all parties, having all the right people at the table, a diversity of input and opinions when a project or development in this area is being reviewed. And then there's also lots that we could talk about just in terms of SON's perspective about, responsibility and relationship to the land sort of versus the concept of ownership. And so, SON, although there are reserve lands, SON's territory is, like I said, Tobermory to Arthur to Goderich to Collingwood. And that's an area that SON has stewardship responsibilities for and deep relationship to. And it's different than being a landowner where you have very specific, set of rights and property lines. So that's unique. But one thing that I think this is a really great group to speak to, and I'm happy to take questions after this, but something that I think often a lot of Canadians don't have a great understanding of is just the difference between rights holders and stakeholders, and what a rights holding group is versus what an interest group is. So often interest groups will reach out to SON seeking SON's involvement, which is great. SON is, I think, always happy to know that there are other groups in the territory who care about the territory and, want to protect the territory and the lands in different ways. But it's a challenging line to walk because, like I said, and like Leah sort of asked me to speak to, is, what are SON's priorities? SON's priority, according to Canadian law, has to be rights protection. So that's the lens that I'm reviewing projects with. And so sometimes there's definitely overlap with interest groups. But it's a very specific and separate process. And so that's why you might sometimes, if you're involved in any of those groups, you might, SON may decline to be involved in, a certain event or promotion or, writing a letter of support or something like that, because it is sort of a separate, well, no, not sort of, it is a separate and nation to nation relationship that SON has with the Crown. And so that's different than an interest group. And all those groups, serve a purpose and we all sort of fit into the puzzle in different ways, but it is unique when you're a First Nation and you're a rights holder. And that may also be, or that is why some of you may have been in meetings where a nation might be very clear that they're not a stakeholder. Often First Nations get referred to as stakeholders, but because First Nations are actually rights holders, referring to them as a stakeholder actually really minimizes their place at the table. So that's kind of a Canadian Constitution, Aboriginal and Treaty Rights 101. And I know it's an area that not a lot of people are familiar with, but there's a lot of really great resources out there, and I can share some with Lee after if people are interested, but it is really foundational to how First Nations are involved in development reviews. And like I said, there is also often a commercial aspect to Aboriginal and treaty rights. And, First Nations are not always anti-development. Like Lee said, there's a fine balance and people need to exist and communities need to find ways to survive and thrive. And so that's a line that that nations are often walking. And I think that's also often a misconception that First Nations are analogous anti-development group. And I think, like everyone can appreciate, we're all part of different communities and communities are not homogenous. And so, sometimes you might hear multiple voices within SON with different perspectives on an issue. And I think that's okay. I think that's great. Like the communities that all of us are part of, not everyone always agrees. And it doesn't sort of reduce the strength or the stance of the nation if there's a diversity of opinions. Hopefully that strengthens it.
Can you just explain the role of or your role on the Sustainable Tourism Advisory Group? Is it, like you say, to look things through a rights lens?
Yeah, so that's a good example. So figuring out how SON should participate appropriately in the Sustainable Tourism Advisory Group, or the STAG group, was an example of us figuring out how we fit into these sort of bigger public interest groups. And so with the tourism question, SON really deals with most of those issues through our relationship with Parks Canada. In that area of the peninsula anyway. In the southern part, we find other ways to participate. But again, it's because it's a nation-to-nation relationship and Parks Canada is a representative of the Crown. And so we have bi-weekly meetings with Parks Canada. It's a working group. And that's sort of our avenue for participating in the sustainable tourism conversation.
One question about this inland fishery is, how would Saugeen Ojibwe Nation get, it's from Joyce, how would you get involved in a case?
Yep, that's a great question. So this project came to my attention because permits to take water are one of my files. And so like Dan was saying, this facility would draw water from Colpoys Bay and also return water to Colpoys Bay. So that was the trigger for getting SON involved. There maybe should have been other triggers, but that was the one that got us to the table. And so for a project like that, how it works is, if technical reviews have already been done, like the EIS or environmental impact study that somebody mentioned, we have a team of technical experts that we rely on. So an ecologist, a hydrologist, and an archaeologist, and then others if we need them. But those are our 3 core experts. So we would receive technical documents that have already been done for a project like that and review those. And then if there was any further technical work to be done, often we have our experts go out in the field as well and supervise to make sure we feel like that work is being done to SON standards. So reviewing technical documents that exist, participating in technical work that is yet to be done. This is a bit of a unique project I think this is a project with a long timeline. This isn't something that's going to be built next year. SON is just at the very, very early days of beginning our technical review. It'll be a very thorough technical review. For anyone who's familiar with SON, I think you know that the fishery is an extremely important part of SON's culture and an extremely important part of the rights conversation, the right to fish, something very important to SON. And so we'll be reviewing this project with an extremely fine-tooth comb. SON would never approve a project that it felt like would have any kind of detrimental impact to the fishery. There are lots of issues with the fishery in Georgian Bay. Salmon stocking is a major of concern for SON and has been for many, many years. And so we'd be looking at this project through that lens. So we've got fisheries technical experts as well. But the short answer is it's very, very early days, and a technical review is how we participate. Often SON is brought in far too late in conversations or not at all. I think a good example of that is the wildlife fencing along Highway 6. If anybody saw that recently, it's sort of south of Lone Wolf. That was fencing that SON wasn't aware of, and it's along the hunting grounds. So we use that as an example of, if MTO or if the proponent had come to SON in the early days, we really could have helped them design a much more appropriate project because we have traditional knowledge of that area. We could have designed a project that SON would have been okay with, and that would have had a much smaller impact on the land and on SON's rights. But the conversation didn't happen at the appropriate time, and a project went ahead in a way that didn't make sense. And so now we're having to backtrack that project, which is unfortunate, and it's expensive, and it's not good for relationships. So early engagement is always the best way when there's a rights holder that should be at the table.
And you spoke a few times about relationships. And I think that might be something that also the other speakers could talk about, like the relationships between all the different parties.
Like obviously public engagement and consulting with the community, the communities early and often is ideal. But it's very difficult for members of the public sometimes to navigate what's going on and the timelines, and like sometimes the public meetings that are mandated come very late in the process. And so then there can be like mistrust because it's like, well, what was the municipality trying to sneak through? Or even sometimes like as a counselor, I'm not finding out about things until there's like a report on the agenda. And sometimes it's just not enough time. And so for me anyway, it's about like having the courage to say, this is a big thing and I need more time to do more research or talk to more people, or I think we need to do more consultation. But ultimately, I think this is why it's really important to have like official plans or one mechanism that you have to create that community vision. There's a lot of community consultation, and like those foundational documents in a community need to be updated often. Like in our case, ours hasn't been updated since 2012. There's been incredible change in the community since then. So I don't think it provides sufficient guidance for making decisions around development. So yeah, ultimately we're making decisions based on good data, and Emily just talked about the technical reviews that are necessary.
How is the public involved in all this? You talked about this, Megan, right? And often the issues are very technical, and it's a technical language that's difficult to understand, particularly at a late stage of the project.
Is there a group now that's learned about the parking lots in Tobermory, or?
That was another one where SON did come to the table. They did a site visit earlier on in 2018, but then like what is adequate consultation? So now they are more involved and working with the proponents, which is really good. And the municipality has deferred a decision. I was surprised about the scale of the change and how quickly it was happening. So obviously as a counselor, you get lots of emails. So basically I just communicated with the people who emailed to me like, hey, this is what's happening. This is why I voted. And this is why I worked hard for getting it deferred. And eventually, that did happen by the third meeting. But yeah, not a formalized group really per se, but just lots of individuals writing letters.
You did have a group form around sustainable tourism very quickly, I know, and that was led by BPEG.
Even though 600 people or more probably now signed the original petition, it's still just a petition. And as we're developing our programs and working with EBC and working with other community members, we need to go back to the community. We need now to say, okay, this is what we're thinking of doing. How do you feel about that? What kind of input can you give us? Because the basic tenet of good community economic development is always go to the community. And if you have community buy-in, then you can never go wrong. It's like doing good market research, you know what people want and you give it to them. It doesn't mean that you'll satisfy everybody all the time, but you can't work in a vacuum. And whether it's the council or it's even a group like we have, we're still planning on doing a big community session 2 weeks into September so that we can get real feedback and increase the momentum that we're trying to create.
Joyce is also on the call. Joyce, is there a shared vision?
There's definitely a shared vision. And from the very beginning, we laid out our principles, which are on our website. And community engagement is really important. And, Linda's emphasized over and over again to our group as an economic development person that you need the community behind you and you can't go wrong. Why not develop your resources based on your community strengths? Why sell that? Why lay that? Put that directly in the hands of who knows who, actually, because we don't even know really who Westway is. And that's why we're fighting so hard. We want the community to be responsible and to be able to step up, because we know how interested and passionate they are and how much talent and resources they have to bring.
But Joyce, you also mentioned earlier that it seems that elected councillors are not really in charge, but staff, and that there's a systemic problem in the process by being staff often having so much power.
Yeah, I was really glad that Megan raised that as a councillor, she finds that something's on her plate in a council meeting, fully reported on by staff, and she hasn't even had time to become familiar with the issues. And this really concerns me. I'm seeing a systemic issue in the way councils are run. Not only are staff kind of divorced from their councillor, the councillor divorced from their staff, how can the people that the councillors are representing feel that they have a say when the councillors themselves are not even informed of what's coming up in the way of development? We feel this very much about the Beaver Valley development, that a lot of what took place in terms of the Westway sale took place behind closed doors, and we were stonewalled and unable to get the ear of council. And you look at the Municipal Act, and yes, anything to do with deals, with real estate deals, yes, it's quite legal for this all to take place behind closed doors, but it was extremely frustrating for us.
Can I ask each panelist just quick closing remarks on, what are the perils of being anti-development as well? Like, I think a lot of jurisdictions or civil servants or whoever might be worried that activist groups are activists solely in purpose, whereas a lot of groups, especially organized groups with governance and such, can safely and intellectually see both sides of an argument, a jobs creation lens, etc. What exactly are the perils of seeing things through as an anti-development argument?
I think for Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, the piece to remember is that it's a diverse community of all ages and all people who live in the community. Not everybody is retired. Lots of people still need to work and support their families. And so there is a need for development in some ways, in that way. And when you're a First Nations person, you can be connected to an area as a non-First Nations person, but the connection to your traditional territory is very different. And there's not the same sort of getting up and leaving to go somewhere where there's work is a much more complicated question. And so making sure that there is, affordable housing in this area, in their territory, ensuring that there's enough development so that there's employment and people can feed their families, while also ensuring that the natural habitat and ecosystems and Aboriginal and treaty rights are protected. That's sort of all up in the air. All of those balls are in the air at the same time. And so being, solely narrowly anti-development, doesn't allow us to balance all of those pieces. So I think I would say that that's the peril. Yeah.
Thanks. Dan, you live in Bruce County and they have what's called good growth. Dan, what does good growth mean to you?
Well, I think good growth involves community involvement and trying to move forward with the vision of the community in mind. You talked about the perils of forming a group. I think our biggest fear, or my biggest fear for our group, was being perceived as anti-development or simply as a not in my backyard kind of group. And we're not. I think we have to look, at a much grander scale and really look to what we see as the future for the area, and try and get a municipal government that is willing to look for response from the public. We put up a site 8 weeks ago. We've had we're edging up on 20,000 views in 8 weeks. Looking at the analytics, people are spending 4.5 minutes average time at our site. So they want to get involved. The community does want to learn. They do want to be involved and they want to have a voice. We've started posting all the responses we get. So I think, my message to municipal government would be, listen, people want to be heard. They do want to talk. All you've got to do is ask and give them produce some kind of a forum where the input's invited.
I'm glad you're doing it, and I'm glad you found out, and I'm glad you've got this support. Linda, you're in Grey County, and Grey has a climate action plan. Is it perilous to be anti-development?
I want to use a quick example that just came up. I mean, first of all, the climate action plan is very supportive. I was able to even pick things out of it with Joyce's help, actually, and say this is what the climate action group is saying, or the plan is saying, and this is how you can integrate this with our services. That's not really talking, though, to anti-development. I heard today, or I heard this week, that somebody was supporting the Westway group because it would return Talisman to a hotel that employed 200 people. We know that the jobs at a hotel like that are usually low paying. A lot of them are part-time. And the opposite to that is, if we develop a training center and a place for ecological education, these are creating much better jobs with more money, more skilled jobs, more scientific jobs. So I think it's a question of education, where you explain to people that those are the kinds of things that are going to happen, and not to put down the fact that a lot of students and work in places like hotels, but we can't dismiss the fact that there's higher education and there's more jobs. It's the largest growing field in environmental positions. So that's the future.
I'll just pass to Megan. Thanks for that, Linda, for the last comment, and then I'll kick it over to Joachim. Heike's question was with regards to enforcement of all these rules and regulation. Like, what is this challenge ahead of you for enforcing all this?
There's never enough people. Like, we're a small staff, and also we don't want this police state of heavy enforcement. But ultimately, in some of like the most severe times, like I think for a few years, like we've really staffed up in terms of bylaw this year. We can't get enough OPP and bylaw people because, once again, there's workforce challenges. There's housing prices are at an all-time high. So like all these interconnected issues that just don't make it straightforward. So education as much as possible. We're also fortunate to live in an area where there's such an amazing, engaged volunteer community, like the Bruce Trail. Stewards and volunteers are absolutely incredible. And it is just really inspiring to live in a community where there's an issue where 70 people will write letters, because that that's democracy. This is why we have public meetings and some of these processes in place that have taken decades and decades to build, like why we have some of the like SON duty to consult stuff. So yeah, ultimately we all just have to learn how to live together, and the more I guess just keeping a respectful dialogue. Like, I know it's really easy to get into the us and them and the NIMBY mentality. And like, I know on the North Bruce, like in terms of visitors who maybe look different than us or sound different, or they have a different upbringing. They've never been on a hike before. They've never been camping. No one, so they don't. So there's just a lot of education that has to happen. But ultimately, if we can learn to have these dialogues in ways that are respectful and not polarizing, and I'm really grateful for, you know, at the conversations that we have at council, like you talk about an issue and there could be differences of opinion or opinions around the table. And then you move on, and on the next issue, you all agree, and ultimately we're all just discussing things and have the best interests of the community at heart.
What Megan said was a really great kind of summing up of the evening, right? There's a lot of potential in all the different groups and how they can work together. And Jeffrey actually made a statement earlier that there could be council kind of support. But there's also a lot of potential to keep things in check, which we also talked about today. Yeah, so the next session is in September, and we talk about local food. So we talk about the larger kind of aspects of local food and the benefits of growing and buying and consuming local foods, also in respect to like as an alternative rather than buying only food from a supermarket. You know, there are lots of downfalls, and so we also can think about the miles that our food often travels. So that will be the next third Thursday, local food. So thanks very much, everybody. I think there was a lot of food for thought today. Local.